10:17 p.m. The cold light from a phone still washed across KateHenshaw's face, but behind that familiar image of a woman audiences had watched stand confidently beneath studio lights was a far more painful reality. Her 12-year marriage to Roderick James Nuttal had reached the place she once hoped it would never reach: the end. What happened behind the closed doors of a relationship that had survived for more than a decade? Why would Kate, a woman known publicly for her strength and determination, finally decide that walking away was better than staying? The timeline takes us back to 1999, when Kate married Roderick. They later welcomed a daughter, and for years their family existed alongside the relentless demands of Kate's career. From the outside, there were premieres, film sets, interviews, flashing cameras, and people calling her name. But a marriage is lived far away from those cameras. Imagine the contrast. The noise of a crowded set disappearing behind her, a front door closing, a quiet hallway stretching ahead, an empty chair at the table, and two people gradually discovering that sharing the same home does not always mean sharing the same emotional world. By 2011, the marriage was over. Yet the most important part of this story is what should not be invented. Kate did not publicly establish a story of Roderick brutally abusing her, so claims that she escaped a hell of physical violence should not be presented as fact. What she did acknowledge after the divorce was painfully simple. The relationship was no longer working, and rather than remain trapped in continuing conflict and disharmony, leaving became the better choice. Those words may sound restrained, but behind them lies the weight of 12 years. The conversations that may have become harder, the distance created by demanding schedules, the disappointment of realizing that something once built with hope could no longer be repaired in the same way. And there was another burden. Work did not stop simply because her private life was breaking apart. The cameras could still turn on. Expectations could still follow her. She could still be required to appear composed while carrying a divorce back home with her at night. Over time, Kate has also spoken publicly about health challenges at different points in her life, reminding audiences that even someone who appears remarkably energetic can experience physical vulnerability. However, those health issues should not automatically be blamed on her marriage or divorce without evidence. That distinction makes the story more human, not less painful. There was no single dramatic frame capable of explaining everything. Only a marriage that had lasted from 1999 to 2011, a daughter connecting two lives forever, a demanding public career, and the realization that sometimes staying can create more conflict than leaving. As the pace of that turbulent year slowly faded, the imaginary room at 10:17 p.m. became quiet again. The phone remained on the table. The chair opposite Kate was still empty. Outside, another working day was waiting for her, but inside that silence was a question she could no longer avoid. After 12 years of marriage had disappeared behind a closed door, how much pain could a person carry before learning to walk away? And the collapse of 2011 would not be the only moment in KateHenshaw's life when she had to discover what it meant to survive something that hurt. Long before the divorce papers, long before 2011, and even before Roderick James Nuttal became part of KateHenshaw's married life, there was another chapter, one Kate would only speak about publicly much later. And one distinction matters from the very beginning. The abusive relationship Kate described was a previous relationship, and she did not publicly identify the man involved. It should not be confused with Roderick. According to Kate's own recollections, that earlier relationship lasted roughly 3 to 4 years, a period during which the confident, smiling woman audiences would later recognize was struggling with fear and a painful loss of self-confidence. The most disturbing part was not a dramatic scene that outsiders could easily see. It was the cycle. She cared about someone who could hurt her, yet hope kept whispering that perhaps the next day would be different. After painful moments could come apologies. After apologies could come gifts, tenderness, and promises. And after those promises, hope could begin all over again. Kate has spoken about reaching a point where she was almost losing the laughter that had once come naturally to her. Imagine what that means. Not simply being unhappy, but slowly becoming unfamiliar to yourself. 3 years, perhaps 4. Enough time for fear to become routine and for unacceptable behavior to begin feeling dangerously normal. Kate even revealed that she had once considered marrying this person. That admission exposes the contradiction at the center of abusive relationships. Knowing that something is hurting you does not always make leaving immediate or easy. The more she loved, the more she could hope he would change. The longer she endured, the further she seemed to move away from the woman she had been before. There may have been mornings when everything appeared ordinary from the outside, when nobody looking at her could understand the private weight she carried. Then another apology, another promise, another reason to wait. But eventually something changed. Not necessarily the man, but Kate's willingness to remain inside that cycle. At some point, she understood that love could not require the disappearance of her confidence, her laughter, or her sense of safety. She had to stop. She had to walk away. There was no need for a cinematic act of revenge, no need to invent a final confrontation. The important moment was the decision itself, choosing an uncertain future over a familiar pattern of pain. Years later, that experience would make her public strength look different. Strength was not simply standing beneath bright lights or smiling for cameras. Sometimes strength was recognizing that another apology could not erase what had already happened. And then the timeline moved forward. The frightening relationship was behind her, at least physically, and 1999 approached with the possibility of something entirely different. That year, Kate married Roderick James Nuttal and began a new chapter of her life, perhaps carrying the hope that the darkness she had survived would finally remain where she desperately wanted it to stay, in the past. 1999. For a moment, the tension disappears. There are no divorce papers on the table, no questions about separation, no reason to look at the future as though the ending has already been written. Kate Henshaw and Roderick James Nuttal choose each other and get married, beginning a chapter that would eventually last around 12 years. It would be misleading to describe those early years as a hell because there is no reliable basis for claiming their marriage began that way. There was once a reason for two people to stay together, to build a home, and to imagine that what they were creating could last. They became parents to a daughter, and Kate suddenly had another identity beyond the actress audiences recognized on screen. She was a mother. But motherhood did not erase the other part of her life. Acting remained deeply important to Kate, something she made clear publicly even before the marriage ended. And as her career continued, the demands surrounding it could be relentless. A film set rarely follows the comfortable rhythm of family life. There are early calls, late finishes, promotional appearances, advertising commitments, interviews, travel, and schedules that can change with almost no warning. Picture the smaller details, not as confirmed scenes from their home, but as the ordinary pressures that can surround such a life. A suitcase returned from one journey but barely unpacked before another commitment appears. A phone vibrating with the next shooting schedule. Dinner arriving while one chair remains empty because work has run late again. None of those things alone destroys a marriage, but repetition can create distance quietly. Kate had to move between worlds, one moment surrounded by cameras, crew members, and people demanding her attention, the next trying to return to the responsibilities of home and motherhood. Somewhere inside that movement was Roderick, also living his own life and carrying his own expectations of what marriage and family should be. There is no need to invent a screaming argument to understand the pressure. Sometimes conflict begins much more quietly, with time that cannot be recovered, conversations postponed until tomorrow, and two calendars that increasingly refuse to align. One week becomes another. One production leads into the next. A family can still smile together while the invisible mathematics of time begins changing underneath them. How many times can two people live according to different schedules before they start feeling as though they are living different lives? That question becomes more important as the timeline moves forward. The woman who had once fought to recover herself from a painful relationship now had a husband, a daughter, and a career she was unwilling to abandon. From the outside, these pieces could look like success. Inside any marriage, however, each one demanded time. Each demanded compromise. Each demanded presence. And slowly, somewhere between the lights of another film set and the silence waiting after the working day ended, the distance between Kate Henshaw's public world and her private life was becoming impossible to ignore. By the time Kate Henshaw and Roderick James Nuttal's marriage began approaching its final chapter, the rhythm of their lives appeared increasingly difficult to synchronize. Reports surrounding the breakup pointed to demanding schedules and the pressures of work as possible sources of strain. But that distinction matters. Kate never publicly offered a complete explanation of everything that happened inside the marriage, so work should not be treated as the single proven cause of their divorce. What can be seen instead are three versions of Kate existing at the same time. To the public, she was still Kate Henshaw, the actress, the woman expected to arrive on set, face the cameras, attend events, and continue working as though private turmoil could simply wait outside the studio door. To her daughter, she was a mother with an entirely different responsibility. Whatever happened between two adults, a child still needed stability, protection, and love. And then there was Kate the wife, looking at a marriage that had survived for more than a decade and confronting a question with no painless answer. Keep trying to hold together something she felt was no longer working, or accept that walking away might cause pain now, but prevent deeper conflict later. As news of the separation spread, speculation rushed into the silence. Tabloid reports circulated various allegations and theories about what had gone wrong. But rumors are not evidence, and those claims should not be transformed into facts Kate herself never confirmed. In many ways, the most revealing element was precisely what Kate refused to give the public. She did not turn every private disagreement into an interview. She did not provide spectators with a detailed catalog of who said what behind closed doors. When pressed about the specific reasons, she described the matter as personal. One word. And suddenly an enormous empty space existed around it. The less she explained, the more outsiders tried to fill that space themselves. Was it work? Was it emotional distance? Had years of incompatible schedules gradually changed the relationship? Newspapers could speculate, strangers could choose sides, but only the people inside that home knew the full sequence of events. Kate's public position was much simpler. The relationship was no longer working, and remaining inside continuing conflict and disharmony was not the life she wanted. Imagine the pressure surrounding that realization. A phone continues ringing with professional commitments. Another appearance is waiting. Another script needs attention. Meanwhile, a marriage of more than 10 years is moving toward separation, and between two adults stands the responsibility neither can simply leave behind, their daughter. That changes the emotional weight of every decision. Divorce is no longer only about deciding where husband and wife will go next. It is also about determining how two parents move forward without making their child carry the burden of their separation. And so the image becomes quieter as the noise of speculation fades. Kate moving toward one future, Roderick toward another, two paths gradually separating after 12 years together, while between them remains the one bond that divorce cannot erase, the daughter whose life connects both directions. 2011. After roughly 12 years of marriage, Kate Henshaw and Roderick James Nuttal reached the end. There was no need for an invented scene of Kate discovering some hidden secret, no need to place violence inside their marriage when Kate herself did not publicly describe it that way. The reality she chose to reveal was quieter, but perhaps more devastating. The relationship was no longer working. When questioned about why she had walked away, Kate spoke about reaching a point where continuing to live amid conflict and disharmony no longer made sense. Sometimes the most painful ending does not arrive with one explosive moment. Sometimes it comes after years of realizing that two people who once chose each other can no longer find a way to move forward together. That is what gives 2011 its emotional weight. 12 years cannot simply disappear. There had been a wedding in 1999, a home, shared memories, responsibilities, and most importantly, a daughter. Yet history alone could not guarantee a future. Kate had already learned something painful before she ever married Roderick. In an earlier relationship, with a man whose identity she did not publicly reveal, she had experienced violence and described a cycle in which hurt could be followed by apologies, gifts, and promises of change. She had once stayed because she hoped things would become different. That history gives another dimension to the woman standing at the crossroads in 2011. Perhaps she understood more clearly than before that remaining in a relationship at any cost is not necessarily victory. But the boundary between these two chapters must remain absolutely clear. When Kate was directly asked whether she had experienced physical violence in the marriage that had just ended, her answer was no. The abuse she discussed belonged to an earlier relationship, not to the marriage with Roderick. That single distinction changes the entire story. It moves the question away from the sensational accusation, "What did Roderick do to her?" and toward something more difficult to answer. What happens when two people who once genuinely chose one another simply reach a place where they can no longer continue together? Perhaps that was why Kate guarded the details so closely. Some parts were personal. The public could see the ending, but not every conversation that preceded it. They could see two names separating after more than a decade, but not measure every disappointment, compromise, or moment of emotional distance that accumulated along the way. And then came the decision. Leave, rather than continue inside a relationship she believed no longer worked. The cameras would continue. Her career would continue. Motherhood would continue. But the marriage would not. Somewhere after the noise of 2011 faded, there was an image far quieter than any headline. One woman standing before a future she had not originally planned, carrying 12 years of memories behind her and one unanswered question ahead. How do you rebuild yourself when the life you once chose is no longer the life you can remain in? After 2011, the story of Kate Henshaw could easily have been turned into another dramatic narrative about illness and physical decline. But that would distort what is actually known. There is no responsible basis for inventing cancer, heart failure, a terminal disease, or portraying Kate as a woman whose body is becoming overwhelmed by one illness after another. The more meaningful story is subtler. What does it take for a human body to keep pace with decades of work, emotional upheaval, motherhood, public scrutiny, and the unavoidable passage of time? After the divorce, Kate did not disappear. The cameras were still there. Productions continued. Public appearances continued. Expectations did not suddenly become lighter because one part of her private life had collapsed. And as she moved deeper into middle age, another kind of pressure became impossible to ignore. The entertainment industry's relentless attention to a woman's face, weight, body, and age. Every photograph could invite judgment. Every physical change could become a conversation among strangers. Yet Kate increasingly became associated with discipline, fitness, and an active lifestyle rather than surrender. Imagine the ordinary rhythm behind that image. An alarm breaking the silence of an early morning, training shoes waiting on the floor, a glass of water beside the bed, and a few quiet minutes before messages, responsibilities, and work begin demanding attention again. These are storytelling images, not claims about her private medical routine, but they capture the larger reality of maintaining yourself when life refuses to slow down. Exercise can strengthen a body, but it cannot stop time. Professional discipline can organize a schedule, but it cannot erase exhaustion. And appearing powerful in public does not mean a person never experiences vulnerability in private. That is why Kate's story after divorce becomes less about searching for another shocking diagnosis and more about endurance. She had to continue being an actress while being judged as an aging woman in an image-conscious industry. She had to remain a mother while navigating a family structure changed by divorce. She had to protect her own well-being while continuing a career built around deadlines, travel, and visibility. None of that proves that her marriage caused physical illness, and it would be misleading to draw such a connection without evidence. What it does reveal is the accumulated pressure of a life lived at high speed. Years pass. The body changes. Energy has limits. The mirror reflects time whether the cameras are rolling or not. But perhaps the greatest transformation was not something visible in a photograph. Kate had already survived a painful relationship before marriage, watched a 12-year marriage end, and then faced the task of building a life beyond it. The lights could expose every line on her face, and the public could debate every decision she made. But there was one thing Kate seemed determined not to allow divorce to take from her: the right to live as herself. Years after the noise surrounding the divorce began to fade, Kate Henshaw's most powerful response was not an accusation against Roderick James Nuttal. It was a statement about herself. Marriage, she made clear, did not define who she was. Those words carry a different weight when placed at the end of everything that came before them. Before marriage, there had been a younger Kate who, according to her own account, endured violence in an earlier relationship with a man she never publicly identified. She had spoken about losing confidence, losing pieces of her happiness, and remaining because hope kept telling her that perhaps tomorrow would be different. Then came 1999. She married Roderick, became a wife, and built a family. She was also a mother, an actress, and increasingly one of the recognizable faces of Nollywood. Then came 2011, when approximately 12 years of marriage ended and the title of wife disappeared from one part of her life. But Kate Henshaw did not disappear with it. That distinction became central to the way she spoke afterward. A marriage could end without erasing the person who had existed before it, inside it, and beyond it. And among all those identities, one remained particularly important: mother. Kate has spoken about the impact divorce can have on children, recognizing that when adults separate, the youngest members of a family can carry consequences they never chose. Her priority was therefore not to turn the breakup into a public war, but to make sure her daughter could have the good things life could offer. Suddenly, Kate's silence around many details of the divorce looks different. Silence does not necessarily mean there was a hidden scandal waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes silence is simply a boundary. There were things she was prepared to discuss: a relationship that was no longer working, the decision to leave rather than remain amid conflict, the lessons she had learned, and the importance of her child. Then there were questions she refused to answer completely. She called them personal. Two simple words that left journalists and strangers standing outside a door they wanted opened. There were things Kate told the world. There were things she described only as personal, and perhaps that boundary was itself part of taking back control. Roderick does not need to become the villain for Kate's decision to matter, just as Kate does not need to become a powerless victim for her pain to be real. Two people once chose one another. They had a child. They spent more than a decade together. Then they reached a point where continuing no longer worked for them. For Kate, what came afterward was not merely learning how to live without a husband. It was learning to reject the idea that marital status determined the value of her life. The actress remained. The mother remained. The woman remained. And somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the unanswered questions and the speculation, Kate seemed to be drawing a quiet line around her own life, as if to say that the public could know the chapters she chose to reveal, but it would never own the entire book. 10:17 p.m. We are back where this story began. The room is quiet now, but this time there is no need to search the glowing screen for another headline. No rumors of betrayal. No desperate attempt to decide who was right and who was wrong. No sensational accusation demanding that one person become the villain of a marriage that ended more than a decade after it began. Strip all of that away, and only a few things can be said with confidence. Kate Henshaw married Roderick James Nuttal in 1999. Their marriage lasted approximately 12 years before ending in 2011. When Kate later spoke about the separation, she said the relationship was no longer working and suggested that leaving was better than continuing to live amid conflict and disharmony. When directly questioned about physical abuse within that marriage, she said no. And before Roderick, there had been another relationship. A relationship Kate herself described as violent, lasting roughly 3 to 4 years, involving a man whose identity she chose not to reveal publicly. 3 moments now seem to overlap in the silence. There is the younger Kate, frightened and losing confidence while still hoping someone might change. There is Kate in 2011, looking at the remains of a 12-year marriage and accepting that staying at any cost was not the future she wanted. And then there is Kate years later, still working, still appearing before cameras, still carrying the responsibilities of motherhood, and still refusing to allow the word divorced to become the complete definition of her identity. None of these images requires us to say she won. None requires us to claim that Roderick destroyed her life. Real relationships rarely fit so neatly into the roles that headlines create for them. Perhaps that is why the unanswered parts of Kate's story remain unanswered. She revealed some things. Others she protected behind one simple boundary: personal. And as the imaginary clock remains frozen at 10:17 p.m., even the questions begin to lose their urgency. What happened in every conversation behind closed doors? What was the precise moment 2 people realized they could no longer continue? Those answers do not appear on the screen. The phone finally turns face down against the table. Beside it sits a glass of water, untouched. Across the room is the same empty chair that has followed this story from the beginning. Kate remains still for another moment, caught somewhere between the woman she once was and the life waiting beyond that room. Then she rises. 1 step. Another. She moves toward the doorway, but the imaginary camera does not follow her. It stays exactly where it is, focused on that empty chair, the untouched glass, and the silent phone. Somewhere beyond the frame, a door opens. Then the sound of footsteps enters the hallway, growing softer and softer until there is almost nothing left to hear.